Hi, I just quickly want to talk about knife sheaths. I keep hearing people say that in the early medieval period, sheaths were rustic affairs made at home and decorated at home. Um, and I don't think the archaeology supports that. In fact, I'd say the archaeology supports the opposite, that these are things made by professionals. So even this is a relatively simple sheath. Back seam, really common in the Viking era. This one's a Coppergate copy, and the back seam is whip stitched, so you can kind of see in there the stitches goes through the leather, which is sort of pursed up like you'd sew a piece of cloth, and then it's whipped around the seam. That means that this sheath has to be cut to shape before I sew it. I can't sew it together and then trim it all back. It has to be cut to shape, which means you need to know what that shape is for the knife that you're making. To me, suggests a professional. And then again, on top of that, looking at the thicknesses of the leather and how tight and flush these seams are, I have to skive this leather. So I thin the leather where the stitching is going to be so that it folds up more easily and creates a tighter fit. So I can put the stitches quite close towards the edge, and then it all just pinches up. So again, more sign of being professional. Otherwise you end up with a big bulky seam, and we just don't see that. That's a relatively simple one. So you could perhaps use a more generic sort of pattern and just make it fit your knife, and this suspension flap will just change, potentially. But again, when we look at other originals, so this one's a copy of a Dublin sheath with this very angular, well, very accentuated suspension flap with this big curve coming through. See several of these in Coppergate as well. So they're another quite common style. And to get the leather to do this, you can see where the stitching runs very similar to where it does on the original. So this is all being pushed and forced into shape. And the only way I can manage it, perhaps they knew something that I didn't, is by using a last. So I have a piece of wood and I put the knife in, and then I slide the piece of wood inside, and that pushes it out while it starts to dry, and I have to stretch down in this area here. Needs stretching before I put this in, and then this stretches it even further as I hammer it down into the sheath as it goes. That's the only way you can get it, as far as I can tell. There are perhaps other ways, but my trial and error, that's where I've been led to. And I do think, looking at the shapes of sheaths, they probably were using lasts. We have quite a few of the sort of broke back style knife blades, but we rarely see broke back style shaped knife sheaths. They tend to be all the same shape. Sometimes they even have a broke back impressed into it. So they're probably making all of their knife sheaths on a last, and then you go along with your knife and you'd find which one your knife fitted in that you like the look of, potentially. So that's back seamed. Obviously people say, oh, there's the simpler type A's, the folded over ones, and it's folded sheaths like these. This one is the copy of a find from the Thames Street in London. Anglo-Saxon, supposedly, because of this notch. So it's not Viking, it's Viking age, but Anglo-Saxon. And yeah, in some ways it's much easier to just fold this over, and you've got the basic shape. So it could be sewn at home, except all of these, including the Broomfield folded sheath, which is 6th century, so hundreds of years before this one existed, and the seams are what we call half tunnel stitched. So the stitching goes all the way through the back of the leather, but on the front it goes into this leather and then tunnels along inside and then comes back out onto the reverse. So there's no visible stitching on the front. That is not something you're doing at home. You need specific tools to be able to do it, and practice. It's not something you make every couple of years for the sheath that for your knife, or even with a family. You know, this is the job of a professional, even if we don't look at the decoration. And while everybody will be like, oh no, that's obviously done by a professional. This though is just really simple and could be done at home, except you're not making it at home because you're buying leather, which you're not going to buy bits of leather. It's an expensive commodity. You know, now I buy whole hides. They weren't doing that back then. They didn't have a stash of leather in the back of the house, the back of the cupboard. And while this is impressed decoration, it's not incised. I don't cut the leather when I do that. You don't get cutting of leather in tooling techniques until well after the conquest. This is impressed, which means I need to case the leather before I tool it, which is I wet the surface, which allows me to compress the surface of the leather down onto the firmer, drier leather. Which means if I was to buy the sheath and then take it home and decorate it, the sheath would have to be unfinished. It'd be sewn, but this is meant to protect your knife as well as you, but it's to protect the knife. It needs to be waterproof. So you'd be buying it, taking it home, tooling it, and then waterproofing it. And I can't see that. You'd sell it as a finished product. And then again, to impress it, you need tools, specific tools. You can't use the back of a knife. Medieval Viking age knives are really thick. The spine on them is quite chunky, or it's peaked, which doesn't really give you anything to work with either. You'd need specific tools, and you could perhaps have them at home. But realistically, materials are expensive. Horn, antler, bone, the things that we'd use for tooling, perhaps steel and iron, are all things that are sought after and used for other things. And people didn't have a set of leatherworking tools at home. They bought their things in. So, yes, made by professionals, even when they're simple. And just because they don't meet our standards, our modern standards of computer designed and industrially produced items, doesn't mean they weren't done by professionals. There are later 15th century, 16th century eating knife sheaths where it's multiple layers of leather combined together, sewn in, and there's little pockets for prickers as well as the knife, and there's this beautiful scroll work coming up them with floral designs. And when you actually get up close and look at it, it's quite naive. It's done by a professional. It's just done by a professional who really doesn't have the concept of perfection. And I don't think perfection was a thing that existed. So, not a high status piece. This isn't flash. This is simple, well produced by a guy who knew what he was doing. They didn't have rustic stuff. They had professionally made items. You'd go to a thing, you'd go to a market, you'd pick them up then. It would be part of your day out of buying your new knife and perhaps a new knife sheath. You might not buy a new knife. You may keep your old one and go along and buy a new sheath for your knife as part of your enjoyment of the festival. So yeah, no rustic stuff. Nice, professionally made bits.